The war had ended, but Europe was still bleeding. In the spring of 1945, silence hung over the ruins like fog, thick, heavy, and deceptive. The guns had ceased, yet the cries of hunger, grief, and disbelief filled the air where artillery once thundered. Germany lay broken, its cities hollowed out by years of bombing, its fields scarred by tank treads and craters. What remained was not peace, but the echo of survival. In those first fragile weeks after surrender, American soldiers patrolled through the ruins of the Reich, uncertain of what to expect. They were victors, yes, but victory felt hollow amid the rubble of civilization. The war had stripped the land bare, and now it revealed its human cost in the faces of the living, faces pale with hunger, eyes wide with fear, hands trembling at every sudden sound. Private First Class James Donovan of the 95th Infantry Division was among them. He was 22, a milk farmer's son from Wisconsin, used to the rhythm of early mornings, cold bottles, and the soft sound of cows in the barn. For 3 years, he had fought his way across Europe, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the burning streets of Aachen. He'd seen men die, friends vanish, and hope flicker like a candle in a storm. When the fighting ended, he thought he would feel relief. Instead, he felt hollow. The quiet unnerved him more than the chaos ever had. On a cold April morning, Donovan's unit was stationed near a small village outside Kassel, a place so battered that even its church steeple leaned, fractured at the base. The villagers were ghosts, thin, shivering shapes who moved slowly, speaking little. The Americans had been told to distribute food cautiously. Supplies were limited, and desperation made people dangerous. Yet as Donovan stood guard beside the convoy truck, his eyes caught something that refused to fade. A woman standing in the shadows of a collapsed house, clutching a bundle of rags that moved ever so slightly. He thought it was a trick at first, the way the wind tugged at things. But then he saw the small hand, pale and fragile, reach out from the folds of fabric. The woman's name, he would later learn, was Rewrote. She was 28, her hair cropped unevenly, her dress a patchwork of whatever she could salvage. Her husband had been drafted into the Wehrmacht in 1944 and never returned. Her home had been destroyed in a bombing raid, and she'd been surviving on boiled weeds and rainwater. The bundle in her arms was her son, Emil, barely a year old. Donovan couldn't look away. The child's cheeks were hollow, his lips cracked and gray. Anna's eyes held a desperate calm, the look of someone who had already made peace with losing everything. He'd seen that expression before on soldiers too tired to fight and too proud to surrender. That evening, after the rations were distributed and the men returned to camp, Donovan couldn't eat. The army stew tasted of ash. He thought of that baby, the trembling hand, the faint wheeze that came with each breath. His sergeant's voice echoed in his head. No fraternization, no exceptions. But something deeper stirred in him, something that had nothing to do with orders or sides. It was the instinct of a man who had spent his life delivering milk to families before dawn, who had seen hunger in the eyes of calves and kindness in the hands of his mother, when she fed the stray cats that wandered to their porch. That night, as rain fell over the camp, Donovan filled a canteen with milk from the company kitchen. He tucked it under his coat and slipped into the darkness. The road to the village was quiet, lined with the blackened skeletons of trees. Every step he took was a whisper of risk. If he were caught, he'd face a court-martial. But as he neared the ruins where he had seen the woman, the thought of punishment faded beneath something far stronger, the need to do what was right. He found her where she had been that morning, sitting in the doorway of a shattered house, the baby pressed against her chest. When she saw him, she froze, her eyes darting toward the road. He raised his hands slowly, wordlessly, then drew out the canteen. For a moment she didn't move. Then with trembling fingers she took it. The baby whimpered softly as she tilted the canteen to his lips. Donovan watched as the child drank, tiny gulps at first, then greedier ones until the milk ran down his chin. Anna closed her eyes. He saw her shoulders shake, though whether from sobs or relief he couldn't tell. Donovan stood there in silence, the rain drumming softly against the ruins. When she handed the canteen back, her hands lingered on it as if it were the last precious thing left in the world. He nodded once, then turned to leave. He didn't expect to see her again, but the next day she appeared at the edge of the American perimeter, carrying the empty canteen. She waited uncertain until Donovan stepped forward. She didn't speak English, he knew no German, yet somehow between gestures and glances they understood each other. He filled the canteen again. This time he stayed long enough to see Emil smile, a small, fleeting smile that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. In a world that had been burned to its bones, that smile felt like mercy itself. As the days passed, Donovan continued his quiet visits, Sometimes he brought bread or a blanket, sometimes just water and company. The other soldiers noticed his absences but said nothing. Everyone had their ghosts to chase, and maybe in helping her, Donovan was learning to silence his own. Word spread among the villagers of the American with the milk, and some began to nod or wave when he passed. It wasn't gratitude they showed, more like acknowledgement that kindness still existed, even here among enemies. But nothing in war or its aftermath remains untouched for long. One evening, an officer spotted Donovan returning from the village. The next morning, he was summoned to headquarters. The colonel's words were sharp and cold. Aid the civilians through official channels. Maintain distance. The war may be over, but discipline is not. Donovan listened, standing stiffly at attention, the weight of guilt pressing against the flicker of righteousness inside him. When the colonel finished, Donovan simply said, "Understood, sir." But his eyes told a different story. He returned to his post, the canteen now confiscated, his heart heavy. That night he lay awake, staring at the canvas ceiling of his tent, hearing the echo of the child's breathing in his mind. The war had been about destroying evil, about saving lives. Yet here he was, forbidden to save one that was right in front of him. 2 nights later, he slipped out again. The village was darker than usual, the moon was veiled behind clouds. He carried nothing this time, no milk, no bread, just his presence. When he reached the ruins, the woman was gone. Panic surged through him. He called softly into the night, his voice swallowed by the wind. Then he heard it, a faint cry from the other side of the rubble. He found her there, cradling Emil, weaker now than before. The child's skin was pale, his breath shallow. Donovan knelt beside them, helpless. For all the violence he'd endured, this was the cruelty he could not bear, the slow, silent death of innocence. He took off his jacket, wrapped it around them both, and sat through the night, holding his rifle in one hand, her trembling shoulder in the other. When dawn came, a jeep rolled up the road. It was the colonel. He had followed the tracks. Donovan rose to meet him, eyes hollow but unflinching. The colonel looked past him to the mother and child, then back to his soldier. He said nothing. He simply nodded once, turned, and drove away. That morning, a new order was issued. All surplus milk from the camp kitchen would be distributed to civilian mothers with infants. No one asked why. Donovan didn't explain. He just stood by the convoy, handing out bottles as the women lined up, one by one. Anna was among them, her eyes meeting his for a brief, wordless moment. She smiled, a soft, grateful smile that would stay with him for the rest of his life. In the wreckage of war, that simple act of mercy became its own quiet victory. And somewhere in the ruins of Germany, a mother's heartbeat slowed to peace as her child drank milk given by the hands of an American soldier. The first real warmth of spring crept slowly into Germany that May, but the land still felt cold. Frost lingered in the hollows of collapsed buildings. Smoke clung to the edges of every morning. There was no music, no laughter, only the creak of wagons, the shuffle of boots, and the hollow echo of church bells that no longer called anyone to prayer. What little remained of the country seemed to hold its breath, as if afraid that peace itself might break under the strain of hunger and memory. For James Donovan, the days after the colonel's silent order blurred into a strange rhythm, half duty, half redemption. Each morning, he helped unload tins of milk from supply trucks, handing them to German women who queued in the courtyard of what had once been a schoolhouse. The building was roofless, its walls pocked with bullet holes, but in that courtyard there was a different kind of quiet. No shouting, no begging, only the faint murmurs of mothers rocking infants against their chests, the rustle of cloth, and the soft sound of Bobby's drinking. The first time Donovan saw Anna Rewrote among them again, she was standing near the back, her hair tied beneath a torn scarf, Emil bundled close. The boy looked stronger now, his cheeks fuller, his eyes more alert. When she reached the front of the line, she didn't speak. She just took the bottle he offered and touched her hand briefly to her heart before stepping aside. It was a gesture he'd come to recognize, a silent thank you from those who could not find the words. The milk runs became routine. Every day the trucks returned from the American base with more supplies, and every day the same women appeared. Donovan learned their faces, their children's names, even the small details of their survival. There was Frau Weber, whose husband had died in Stalingrad, and little Lot, who refused to drink unless someone hummed a tune. There was the elderly widow who always carried a picture of her 2 sons, both lost in the Russian winter, and still asked if anyone had seen them. The Americans had come as conquerors, but in those small courtyards and broken villages, the lines between enemy and ally began to blur. The war had ended on paper, but the humanity that had been buried under years of hatred was only now beginning to breathe again. Donovan wasn't sure what to make of it. He still felt uneasy when German men stared at him from the shadows, their faces unreadable. He still dreamed of artillery and blood and smoke. Yet every time he saw Emil's frail hands clutch a bottle, something inside him softened, something he'd thought the war had burned out of him forever. He began to notice small signs of life returning. A few children laughing as they chased a stick down a street. A woman sweeping the steps of a house with no roof. A baker reopening a shop using flour traded for cigarettes. Each act felt like defiance, a refusal to let the world end completely. One afternoon, as Donovan was finishing his shift, Anna approached him after the others had left. She held a small loaf of bread wrapped in paper, still warm. She tried to offer it to him, her hands trembling, but he shook his head. "No," he said quietly, though he knew she didn't understand the words. He gestured for her to keep it, but she insisted, pushing it toward him. In the end, he took it not out of hunger, but because refusing felt like rejecting her dignity. When he tore a piece and handed it back to her, she smiled. It was the first time he had seen her smile fully, not the weary gratitude of survival, but something deeper, something like hope. Over the next few weeks, that fragile connection grew. When his duties ended, Donovan sometimes walked the village perimeter, pretending to check for stragglers or repair signs. In truth, he was searching for small reasons to see her again, a brief greeting, a nod, the quiet presence of someone who reminded him that the world might still contain kindness. The other soldiers noticed. Some teased him good-naturedly, others warned him to be careful. The occupation was still new, and not all of his comrades believed compassion belonged in a conquered land. But Donovan didn't care much for opinions anymore. He'd spent too many months watching orders destroy lives to mistake obedience for morality. One evening, after the day's rations had been distributed, he found himself walking near the ruins of the village church. The steeple, cracked by a shell, cast a long shadow in the setting sun. He saw Anna sitting inside what had once been the nave, her son asleep in her lap. A few candles flickered on the broken altar, their light soft against the stone. She looked up when he entered. For a moment, neither moved. Then she smiled faintly and gestured for him to sit. He hesitated, regulations echoed in the back of his mind, but the weariness in her eyes made him step forward. They sat together in silence, the kind that felt shared rather than empty. Emil stirred, and Anna began to hum, a melody so quiet it was almost lost in the wind. Donovan didn't know the tune, but it reminded him of the lullabies his mother used to sing when the barn cats were restless. The sound filled the broken church, small and human against the vastness of ruin. After a while, she pointed to the child and then to him. "Dank," she whispered, one of the few words he knew. He nodded, his throat tight. Outside, the sun dropped below the horizon, and the first stars appeared, faint pinpricks of light above a land still learning how to breathe again. For the first time since the invasion of Normandy, Donovan felt something like peace. Not the kind promised in treaties or speeches, but the quiet peace that comes from knowing that compassion can survive even in the ashes of war. But the war's shadow wasn't gone. Every morning brought new reminders, minefields still claiming victims, refugees flooding roads north and west, whispers of reprisal killings and missing prisoners. The U.S. Army was trying to bring order, but order meant rules, and rules often crushed whatever humanity tried to rise in their cracks. Rumors began to circulate about the milk program. Some officers questioned why American rations were being used on enemy civilians. Others argued that compassion was softening discipline. Donovan heard the whispers in the mess hall, the clipped tones of resentment in officers' quarters. One morning, he found a note on his bunk, unsigned, just a few words scrawled in pencil. "You can't save them all." He didn't need to know who wrote it. The truth was obvious, he couldn't save them all, but maybe he could save one. Then in early June, the orders came down. The division would move north toward Hanover. Occupation duties were being rotated. The milk distribution would be handed to local authorities. When Donovan heard the news, something inside him cracked quietly. It wasn't sorrow exactly, more like the ache of unfinished mercy. He walked to the church ruins that evening and found Anna there, as he knew he would. She looked up as he approached, reading everything in his expression before he spoke. He tried to explain, to say he was leaving, but words failed. So he reached into his pocket and pulled out his service canteen, the same one that had begun it all. He offered it to her. She shook her head, tears glinting in the candlelight, then took it gently in both hands. Emil woke, staring at him with wide, uncomprehending eyes. Donovan smiled and brushed the child's head. "Be strong, kid," he murmured, though the words were for himself as much as for the boy. When he left the village the next morning, he didn't look back. The trucks rumbled through the mist, engines growling low, the smell of fuel and morning dew mixing in the air. Around him, the men joked and smoked, thinking of home. Donovan sat in silence, watching the horizon. Behind him lay the ruins of a country. Ahead of him, the uncertain promise of peace. He didn't know that this would not be the last time he'd see Rewrote and her child. Because mercy, once given, has a way of finding its way back, even across oceans and years. The road north wound through the heart of a defeated nation. Towns that had once been alive with parades and banners now lay stripped bare, their people hollow-eyed and silent. Fields that had fed generations were trampled, poisoned by shellfire, littered with helmets and twisted wire. Every mile was a map of loss. Yet amid the wreckage, new colors began to bleed through: a patch of green, a roof repaired, a white flag fluttering in a breeze that no longer carried the sound of gunfire. Private First Class James Donovan sat in the back of a military truck, his rifle across his knees, watching the countryside roll by. It had been 2 days since they'd left Kassel, and he hadn't spoken much. The other men were talking about home, about farms in Iowa, girls in Chicago, cars they hadn't seen in 3 years. But Donovan's thoughts were elsewhere, fixed on a roofless church and a woman's soft humming echoing in the dark. The convoy rumbled into Hanover in the late afternoon. The city had taken the war like a punch to the gut. Entire districts were flattened, streets lined with the shells of what had been homes. Children darted between ruins like shadows, barefoot and thin, while soldiers handed out powdered milk and cigarettes to crowds that seemed too stunned to speak. The air smelled of ash and wet brick. Donovan's new assignment was routine guard duty at a requisitioned factory complex that served as a supply depot. Days passed in monotonous rhythm, watch rotations, inventory checks, the occasional scuffle with looters, yet the stillness gnawed at him. After years of battle, the absence of chaos was a kind of madness in itself. He missed movement, purpose, the sense that each breath had meaning beyond endurance. Every night as he lay on his cot staring at the corrugated ceiling, he thought of Rewrote and her child. He wondered if the milk truck still came, if the villagers still gathered in the schoolyard courtyard. In his mind, he saw her eyes, steady and sad, and Emil's faint smile as he reached for the bottle. He told himself they were alive, that his small act of mercy had mattered. Yet part of him feared they were already ghosts, swallowed by the hunger and sickness sweeping through the countryside. Weeks passed. Orders came down for the Americans to begin coordinating with the British in the nearby sectors. Refugees flooded the roads, Polish survivors, liberated forced laborers, and German civilians fleeing the east. The line between enemy and victim blurred until it vanished altogether. Disease followed hunger. The stench of decay lingered even where flowers began to bloom again. One afternoon, Donovan was assigned to escort a Red Cross convoy delivering medical aid to a camp near Kassel. He'd heard rumors about it, not a combat post, but one of the displaced persons centers built to house survivors of the concentration camps. Nothing had prepared him for what he saw. The camp lay on the edge of a forest, surrounded by barbed wire that had once held prisoners. The gates were open now, the watchtowers abandoned, but the ghosts had not yet left. Inside were hundreds of people, men, women, and children, skeletal and shivering, wrapped in rags, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. Nurses moved between them, carrying buckets of water and medicine. The air was thick with disinfectant and quiet moaning. Donovan helped unload crates of supplies, his hands numb despite the spring sun. He tried not to stare, but the sights burned into him nonetheless. The way the children's bones showed through their skin, the way the women flinched at sudden sounds, the way no one spoke above a whisper. An old man sitting near the gate caught his eye. He was sketching something in the dirt with a stick, a crude outline of a house, then a cow, then a small boy holding a bottle. Donovan crouched beside him. The man looked up, smiled faintly, and pointed at the drawing. "Home," he whispered in a thick accent. The word struck Donovan like a bullet. Home. He thought of Wisconsin's fields, of the smell of hay and morning milk. He thought of Anna and Emil, waiting in a village that might already be starving again. He realized that for all the destruction around him, there was still one thing left that could be rebuilt, the idea of mercy itself. That night, as the convoy returned to Hanover, Donovan couldn't shake the thought. The war had created monsters, But it had also created moments, fleeting, fragile moments, where decency defied the abyss. He had seen it in the way a German mother cradled her child, in the way a nurse wiped the face of a dying man she'd never met, in the way soldiers shared cigarettes with the same people they'd once been ordered to kill. It was those moments that made the ruin bearable. But not everyone saw it that way. The tension between occupying soldiers and civilians was growing. Reports of theft, assaults, and revenge killings began to circulate. German resentment simmered under the surface, and some Allied soldiers, exhausted, bitter, took out their anger where they could. Command cracked down hard, issuing curfews and punishments, but discipline couldn't mend the wounds in men's souls. One night while patrolling near the depot, Donovan heard shouting from an alley behind a warehouse. He rounded the corner to find two American soldiers, drunk, laughing, cornering a German woman. Her hair was pulled loose, her face streaked with dirt and terror. Donovan didn't hesitate. He drew his sidearm. "Enough," he said, his voice low. The laughter stopped. The soldiers turned, sneering when they recognized him. One of them, a corporal, spat at his boots. "She's just a kraut," he muttered. Donovan raised the pistol slightly. "She's a person," he replied. For a moment no one moved. Then, grudgingly, the men stepped back, cursing as they stumbled away into the night. The woman collapsed against the wall, shaking. Donovan holstered his weapon and crouched beside her, offering his canteen. She took it with trembling hands, whispering something that sounded like dank. That single word pulled him backward in time, to another woman, another night, another act of quiet defiance. He felt the old ache return. He walked her home, a roofless apartment where an old man sat by a candle, clutching a photograph. Before he left, she pressed something into his hand, a small ribbon, blue and frayed at the ends. He didn't understand the gesture, but he kept it. He would keep it for years. The next morning, the captain called him into the office. Someone had reported the incident. Donovan braced for punishment, but the captain only sighed. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. "But be careful, son. Kindness can look a lot like disobedience in times like these." Donovan nodded. The words settled heavy in his mind. As the months dragged on, letters from home began to arrive, thin envelopes that smelled faintly of cornfields and soap. His mother wrote about spring planting, about the cows calving early, about the neighbor's son who'd come home missing a leg. She asked when he'd return, whether he was eating enough. She wrote nothing of glory, only of life continuing quietly, stubbornly. He didn't tell her about the milk, or the mother, or the child. Some stories were too fragile to survive the distance between war and peace. Then one gray morning in July, a message arrived from an army courier. It was addressed to him. The note inside was short, written in halting English, its letters uneven. "The child lives, we remember. A.R." He read it twice before he understood. On a Rewrote. No one could tell him how the message had found its way to him, or who had carried it across the miles between Kassel and Hanover. But it didn't matter. Somewhere out there, in the ruins of Germany, a child was alive because he had refused to look away. He folded the note carefully and slipped it into his breast pocket above his heart. For the first time in months, the silence didn't feel so heavy. The war had taught him how to kill, but mercy had taught him how to live. By the autumn of 1945, the world was learning to walk again. The guns had fallen silent, but their echo lingered in every broken window and every scarred face. Europe smelled of damp brick, burned oil, and the faint sweetness of earth reclaiming what the war had stolen. Across the continent, soldiers were boarding ships, refugees were following rivers, and new borders were being drawn not on maps, but in people's hearts. For James Donovan, the war was no longer measured in battles or medals, but in letters, thin, folded fragments of humanity that found their way across the wreckage. He carried on a Rewrite's short note in his breast pocket like a relic, the paper softening with time. "The child lives, we remember." He would take it out on long nights and stare at the handwriting, imagining the careful movement of her hand, the flicker of a candle, the whisper of a language that was once his enemy. He was stationed now near Bremen, part of the dwindling American occupation force tasked with maintaining stability and order in the British zone. The days were filled with routine, ration checks, paperwork, patrols that rarely saw danger. Yet underneath the monotony lay a strange unease. The world was moving on, but Donovan felt left behind, like a ghost haunting a war that refused to release him. Everywhere he looked, Germany was transforming. The black market stalls multiplied, run by women who traded jewelry for bread and soldiers who traded cigarettes for memories. Children learned English faster than they learned arithmetic. Propaganda posters had been replaced by food ration notices and Allied decrees, and amid it all, the slow pulse of life returned, stubborn, defiant, miraculous. One evening, while overseeing the loading of supply crates, Donovan found himself talking to a British officer who had served in Normandy. The man smoked constantly, his hands trembling as he spoke. "You know," he said, exhaling, "they told us we'd be building peace, but peace feels a lot like standing in the ruins, waiting for someone else to start." Donovan said nothing. He knew exactly what that meant. After the officer left, he sat on the back of a truck and opened his mother's latest letter. She wrote that the cows were producing well that year, that the barn had been painted white again, that his younger brother had enlisted in the Merchant Marines. "We're proud of you, Jimmy," she wrote, "but I pray you're finding something to believe in again." He folded the letter and stared out over the camp. The stars above Bremen were faint behind a haze of distant smoke. Something inside him stirred, a thought, a need, and before dawn broke, he found himself writing back. He didn't write to his mother. He wrote to Anna. The letter was awkward at first, halting, the way a man relearns speech after years of shouting. He kept it simple, that he was alive, that he hoped she and Emil were safe, that the world felt emptier without the sound of their laughter. He didn't know where to send it, so he addressed it only to Anna Rewrote, Kassel district, and gave it to a German postal worker he'd come to trust. The man read the name quietly, then nodded. "We will try," he said. Weeks passed with no reply. Donovan told himself he hadn't expected one. But every morning when the mail truck arrived, his heart betrayed him by listening for his name. Then one cold morning in November, it came, a small envelope, edges smudged, handwriting uneven but unmistakable. Inside was a short letter written in careful, broken English. "Mr. Donovan, the baby walks now, he laughs much. There is bread again, you were kind when no one was. You gave us milk when the world gave only stones. I pray you are home soon. If you are ever in Kassel again, you will find us near the river. The old schoolhouse still stands. God keep you. Anna Rewrote." He read it 3 times before the words truly settled in him. He could see it all as if he stood there again, the courtyard, the line of women, the gray sky above. He imagined the boys' laughter, the echo of it between ruined walls. For the first time in months, he felt warmth spread through the cold corners of his chest. That night, he showed the letter to no one. He folded it carefully and placed it beside the first, the 2 notes pressed together like bookends to a story that wasn't finished yet. The following week, the order came down. Donovan's unit would be demobilized. The army was sending its men home in waves, and his number had finally come up. There were cheers, laughter, and plans for beer and parades, but Donovan felt none of it. He packed slowly, each item a reminder of the world he was leaving behind, a canteen dented by shrapnel, a ribbon he still didn't understand, and those 2 fragile letters. On the day of departure, he stood by the convoy trucks and looked out over the gray city. Civilians gathered by the roadside to watch the soldiers leave, some waving, others simply staring. Donovan scanned the crowd, half hopping, half afraid to see a familiar face. He didn't. When the engines roared to life, he climbed aboard, gripping the side rail until his knuckles whitened. The journey west took 3 days. They passed through villages slowly rebuilding themselves, bakeries reopening, children playing in the rubble, farmers tilling land that still bore the scars of bomb craters. At every stop, Donovan saw life insist on returning, and each time it humbled him anew. When his ship finally crossed the Atlantic, he stood on deck and watched the horizon stretch endless and gray. America waited beyond it, home, peace, everything he was supposed to want. Yet part of him felt the pull of another place, across the ocean, where a woman and child had taught him that compassion could outlast destruction. He arrived in New York in December. The city was dazzling, alive, bright, almost obscene in its abundance after the deprivation he'd seen. Crowds cheered as soldiers disembarked, bands played Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy, confetti drifted through the cold air. Donovan smiled faintly but couldn't shake the weight pressing on his chest. Back in Wisconsin, life resumed with an almost cruel normalcy. The barn smelled the same, the milk pails gleamed under the morning light, and his mother wept as she hugged him at the station. "You're home now, Jimmy," she said softly. "It's over." But it wasn't not for him. At night he dreamed of Germany, of the cracked walls, the soft sound of a lullaby, the face of a child reaching for a bottle. He tried to write again, but his words failed him. The world wanted celebration, not reflection. The newspapers spoke of rebuilding, of politics, of trials in Nuremberg. No one spoke of the smaller salvations that had made survival possible. Months turned to years. The war faded into memory for most, but not for Donovan. He found work driving milk trucks across county lines, a return to the life he'd known before, but now it felt different. Every bottle he delivered carried a story he couldn't tell, a reminder that somewhere across the ocean, there were people whose lives had brushed against his and changed everything. Then, in 1948, a letter arrived. It came with foreign stamps and careful handwriting that made his heart stop before he even opened it. Mr. Donovan, you will forgive me, please. I write again after long silence. Germany grows again, though slow. My son is in school now. He asks where the milk came from that saved him. I tell him an American soldier gave it because mercy is stronger than war. We hope one day you will come see us. Kassel waits for peace, and so do we. Anna. He read it under the soft light of dawn, the smell of fresh milk and hay all around him. The words blurred as his eyes filled, but his smile was steady. That morning, when he set out on his route, he drove slower than usual. The fields shimmered in early mist, and the sound of his truck's engine reminded him of another convoy long ago. For the first time since the war, he felt something lift from his shoulders. The road home, he realized, didn't always lead where you expected. Sometimes it curved back toward the past, toward the places and people who had shown you what humanity could still be, even after the world had forgotten how to be human. And somewhere in Germany, under a gentler sky, a woman and her son waited by a river, believing that kindness, once shared, could travel farther than any army ever had. By the time the letter arrived, the seasons had turned twice, and America had already learned how to forget the war. The newspapers no longer spoke of Europe's hunger or the children still scavenging in rubble. The stories had moved on to baseball scores, post-war prosperity, new automobiles gleaming under soft dealership lights. Veterans like James Donovan were supposed to move on too. He tried. Each morning he drove his milk route through the green fields of Wisconsin, the hum of the truck steady as a heartbeat. He knew every turn, every farmhouse, every barking dog along the fences. People waved. The rhythm was comforting, the clink of bottles, the smell of cold milk, the creak of barn doors. But sometimes, when the light caught the morning mist just right, it was Wisconsin he saw. It was Germany. The air would seem sharper, the horizon lower, and he'd catch himself looking for the shadow of bombed steeples or the faint line of a river winding through ruin. He'd tell himself it was just memory, that he was lucky. He was alive, whole, working. But when the evenings came and the silence grew around him, the ghosts would return. The woman's face, the child's smile, the word dank whispered in rain. He had read Anna's latest letter so many times that the edges were beginning to tear. Her words were careful, polite, written in the plain hope of people still rebuilding from ashes. She didn't ask for anything. She never had. But the letter carried something he couldn't ignore, an invitation not for apology or romance, but for closure, for connection, for proof that kindness hadn't been swallowed by the war. All winter he kept that letter on his nightstand. Then, one February morning, as the barn roof creaked under snow and his breath clouded in the kitchen air, he made a decision. He sold the truck, packed his uniform, and bought a one-way ticket to Europe. When the ship left New York Harbor, he stood at the rail, watching the Statue of Liberty fade into the mist. Around him, other passengers, soldiers, journalists, aid workers, spoke of reconstruction, opportunity, the new world taking shape from the old. But Donovan wasn't chasing opportunity. He was chasing something quieter, something that had never really left him. The voyage took 10 days. The sea was calm, but his heart was. Every night he dreamed of the river in Kassel, of the sound of milk pouring into tin cups, of the child's laugh that had once cut through the silence of ruins. When the ship docked at Bremerhaven, the cold air smelled of salt and coal smoke. He stepped off the gangway and felt, for the first time in years, that he was walking back into unfinished history. Germany in 1948 was a country between worlds. Black market stalls lined the train platforms. Children still played barefoot in rubble, but there were signs of rebirth. Windows repaired, tram lines humming again, laughter that didn't sound afraid. Donovan traveled south by train, sitting by the window as the landscape changed. Factories rising where forests had been, fields dotted with women in headscarves gathering the first shoots of spring. When he reached Kassel, the station was half rebuilt, the clock above it still frozen at the hour of its bombing. He stepped into the chill air and looked for landmarks he might recognize. The church was gone, the schoolhouse was not. Its walls were scarred, its roof patched with mismatched tiles, but it stood. Children's voices echoed faintly from inside, laughter lessons, the sound of life continuing. He waited until the school emptied for the day, then approached a woman sweeping the steps. She was older now, her hair tied back neatly, her eyes watchful but kind. When he spoke her name, her hand froze around the broom handle. "Anna," he said softly. She turned slowly. Recognition bloomed like dawn breaking across her face. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she stepped forward and clasped his hands. "Mr. Donovan," she said in careful English, "you came." He smiled. "I told you I would someday." Inside the schoolhouse, she poured him coffee from a chipped enamel pot. The walls were decorated with drawings, flowers, rivers, suns. In the corner, a small boy played with wooden blocks, his hair light, his face familiar. "Emil," she called, and the child looked up. He couldn't have been more than 5, but his eyes held the same brightness Donovan remembered. He walked over shyly, staring at the stranger in the worn overcoat. Anna placed a hand on her son's shoulder. "This is the man who brought the milk," she said gently. The boy's eyes widened and he smiled. "Amerikaner?" he asked. Donovan nodded, feeling the knot in his throat tighten. "Yes," he said, "American." They talked for hours, haltingly, piecing together words across 2 languages and 1,000 memories. She told him of the years since the war, the famine of 1946, the long winters, the rebuilding. She worked as a teacher now, helping children learn to read again. "They must know words," she said. "Words make peace." He told her about home, the fields, the cows, the quiet life that had once seemed enough. But even as he spoke, he knew the truth. He hadn't come for stories of the past. He had come to see proof of what had survived it. As evening fell, she walked him to the river. The air was cold but clear, and the water shimmered silver under the dying light. He looked around. The ruins were smaller now, softened by time and grass. Life had filled the spaces where death once lingered. When he turned back, Anna was watching him, her face lit faintly by the setting sun. "You should have stayed home," she said softly. "The war took too much already." "Maybe," he replied, "but I think I needed to see this, to know it was worth something." She smiled faintly. It was. They stood in silence for a while, the sound of the river between them. Then Emil ran up, holding something in his hands, a small metal canteen, dented and worn smooth with age. Anna looked at Donovan. "You left it," she said. "I kept it all these years." He took it slowly, feeling the weight of it in his palm, the same canteen that had carried milk through rain and rubble. It felt heavier now, filled with time. "Thank you," he whispered. Anna shook her head. "No," she said, "we thank you." He looked at her then, really looked, and saw not the woman from the ruins, but the survivor who had rebuilt a life from nothing. In her eyes was not sorrow anymore, but quiet strength. They walked back toward the village together. The lamps were lighting one by one, glowing softly against the dusk. Somewhere nearby, a church bell rang, a clear, unbroken sound that seemed to wash the years clean. When they reached the edge of the square, he stopped. "I'll be heading home soon," he said. "Tomorrow, maybe." She nodded. "You will write." He smiled. "I will." He meant it, but both of them knew that some things didn't need to be written again. The story was already complete. As he left the village the next morning, he looked back only once. Anna stood by the riverbank, holding Emil's hand. The boy waved. Donovan raised the canteen in return. Then he turned toward the station, his heart lighter than it had been in years. On the train north, the countryside unfurled in shades of gray and green. The scars of war were still there, always would be. But so were the fields, the birds, the laughter of children on the platforms. Mercy, he realized, was not an act. It was a seed. Once planted, it grew quietly, even in the darkest soil. And as the train carried him toward the coast, toward the long road home, he knew that the milk he had poured into a stranger's hands years ago had become something far greater. It had become the proof that humanity, once lost, could be found again. The years moved quietly after that, like the tide returning to shore. James Donovan came home again in the spring of 1949, carrying only a single suitcase and the dented canteen that had crossed an ocean twice. He stepped off the train into air that smelled of rain and soil, and for a long moment he simply stood there, not as a soldier, not as a ghost of the war, but as a man learning how to belong again. The farm was smaller than he remembered. The barn leaned slightly, the fences sagged, and his mother's hair had gone completely gray. But the fields were green and alive, the cows fat and calm. She hugged him as if afraid he might disappear. "You've gone so thin," she said, her voice cracking with years of worry. "You'll eat now, won't you?" He promised he would. Life after war was quieter, but never simple. Some nights he'd wake to the sound of rain on the roof and feel his heart race, hearing instead the hiss of artillery in distant hills. He never spoke of it to anyone, not even when neighbors asked what Europe had been like. He just said, "Different," and changed the subject. Yet on his desk, beside the small window overlooking the fields, he kept 2 letters and the canteen. They were not souvenirs, they were proof that goodness had survived even where everything else had fallen. He wrote to Anna sometimes, and she wrote back. The letters were fewer now, slower, but each one carried the same steady warmth. She told him of her students, of how the children in Kassel were learning both German and English now. "They must learn the words of peace before they learn the words of pride," she wrote once. Emil was growing fast. He liked drawing airplanes, though he feared loud noises. She said he would start school in the autumn. "He will learn about the war one day," she added. "But I will tell him first that there was kindness too." Donovan smiled when he read that. He began to send small packages, pencils, a red scarf, a box of sweets wrapped carefully in brown paper. In return, she sent him pressed flowers from the riverbank and once a photograph, her and Emil standing beside the rebuilt schoolhouse. In it, she was smiling in a way that seemed to hold all the light of the world. The years turned to decades. America prospered, rebuilt, forgot. New wars began in places with names that meant nothing to the farmers of Wisconsin, and Donovan watched them unfold with the same quiet disbelief that had followed him since 1945. He married a nurse named Clara who had lost a brother in the Pacific. They built a small life together, one built not on grand plans but on small mercies. She understood the silence in him and never tried to fill it. Sometimes on Sundays, he would drive out to the churchyard and sit on the bench by the gate, listening to the bells. He liked the sound, how it was the same in every country, how it had rung above both victory and surrender. When their first child was born, he named the boy Matthew, not after any saint, but because the name meant gift. In 1956, a letter arrived from Germany, forwarded through a veterans association. The handwriting was shakier now, but unmistakable. "Mr. Donovan, Emil is 12. He asks often about America. He wants to see the land where good men came from. I tell him that goodness has no country, only people brave enough to keep it alive. The canteen still sits on our shelf. Sometimes when I wash it, I remember that night, the rain, and the sound of your voice saying nothing at all. Silence can be mercy, too." "Anna." He read it aloud to Clara one evening as the fire burned low. She listened quietly, her fingers brushing his. When he finished, she said, "You did more than fight a war, James. You planted something that grew." He didn't answer, but later that night he took the canteen down from its place on the shelf and turned it over in his hands. The metal was dull now, but his reflection still showed faintly in its curve. He thought of the river, the cold air, and the woman who had carried this small piece of him through all the years between them. Time moved forward, relentless and soft. Emil grew into a man. His letters came now in careful English, filled with questions about life in America. Donovan wrote back, answering each one. When Emil turned 20, he joined a reconstruction project in Hamburg, helping to rebuild schools destroyed by the war. "My mother says I follow your way," he wrote once, "to build instead of break." Donovan folded that letter slowly, pride and grief mingling in equal measure. By the 1960s, his own children were grown. The world had changed again, new music, new fears, new wars. Yet through it all, he carried that quiet, steadfast belief that mercy was the only thing that truly rebuilt anything. When his son left for college, he handed him the canteen. "This," Matthew asked, turning it over curiously, "it's old." "It's more than that," Donovan said. "It's a reminder. Sometimes the smallest thing you carry can weigh more than everything else." Matthew smiled politely, not understanding yet, but he kept it. In 1972, another letter came. It was short, written in Emil's hand. "Mr. Donovan, my mother has passed. She asked that I write to you. Her last words were of gratitude, that the world had once been cruel, but that mercy had found her. She kept the photograph you sent. She said you were proof that even in darkness there is light. With respect, Emil Rewrote." Donovan sat at the kitchen table for a long time after reading it. Outside, the snow was falling softly, covering the fields in silence. He traced the edge of the letter with his finger, feeling the ache that never really went away. Then he took down the canteen again and set it by the window where the light could catch it. In the years that followed, he and Emil wrote occasionally. The younger man sent photographs of his family, of the rebuilt streets of Kassel, of the new school bearing a plaque that read, "In memory of those who brought milk, not bullets." Donovan never told anyone how much that line meant to him. When he died in 1983, his son found a small wooden box among his things. Inside were 2 letters written on fragile paper, the photograph of Anna and Emil, and the canteen. There was also a note in his father's handwriting, faded but steady. "Mercy is not weakness, it is courage without armor." Years later, Matthew would travel to Germany on business. One afternoon, he took a detour to Kassel. The city was bright, alive, filled with laughter. Near the river, he found the school with the plaque. An old caretaker, sweeping the steps, saw the canteen in his hands and smiled. "You are his son?" the man asked in accented English. Matthew nodded. The caretaker led him to a small corner inside the school. There behind glass was a photograph, an American soldier handing a bottle of milk to a German woman holding her child. Beneath it, a line in both languages read, "Mercy is the first step to peace." Matthew stood there for a long time, the canteen heavy in his hand, the hum of children's voices echoing down the hall. For the first time, he understood what his father had meant. War had ended with treaties and surrender, but peace, true peace, had begun with a single act of kindness in the ruins of a dying world. And though the man who had given that mercy was gone, its light still burned quietly in a child who had once been saved, in a school rebuilt from rubble, and in a simple, dented canteen that had carried milk instead of blood.